Jeffrey Dahmer, Aileen Wuornos, Danny Rolling, Gary Ridgway. 9 names, 9 killers, and for years, 9 cases that investigators feared might never be solved. Some of these men hid behind ordinary jobs: a truck painter, a helicopter pilot, a pizza delivery driver, moving through daily American life while entire task forces searched for a name they did not yet have. Others were caught almost by accident, through one victim's desperate escape, or a group of teenagers who could not keep a secret. What every one of these cases shares is the same brutal arithmetic: years, sometimes decades, of families waiting for an answer that the investigators and the technology of the time simply could not yet deliver. Then, one by one, across 2 decades, every single one of these cases finally broke open. Before we go further into this story, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Whisperer. It's much appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you real cold case stories like this one. The late 1980s and the 1990s were, in many ways, a uniquely dangerous stretch of American history for the kind of predators this program covers. Violent crime rates in major American cities climbed through much of the period, driven in part by the crack cocaine epidemic that swept through urban neighborhoods and left large populations of vulnerable people, particularly women involved in survival sex work, at heightened risk from men who understood correctly that their victims were less likely to be reported missing quickly and less likely to receive the same investigative urgency afforded to other cases. At the same time, the forensic tools that would eventually catch many of these men were still in their infancy. DNA profiling was first used in a criminal investigation anywhere in the world only in 1986, and it would take more than a decade for the technology to become fast, affordable, and standardized enough for American police departments to use it routinely, and even longer for states to build the searchable databases that could match crime scene evidence against samples collected years, or in some cases decades, earlier. That gap between when a crime was committed and when the technology to solve it finally caught up created a strange, dangerous window in American history, one in which a killer's greatest advantage was often nothing more than the simple passage of time. The 9 cases that follow all fall inside that window, cases that seemed, for years or even decades, destined to remain permanently unsolved. 1. Jeffrey Dahmer, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The first of these cases begins in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where between 1987 and 1991 a soft-spoken factory worker named Jeffrey Dahmer lured men, most of them young adults he met at bars or bathhouses, back to his apartment on North 25th Street with promises of money or company. Once inside, he drugged them, strangled them, and over the course of nearly 4 years killed 17 people, keeping remains in his home and, by his own later confession, engaging in acts of such extreme depravity that investigators who searched his apartment in July of 1991 described the scene as almost impossible to process. Dahmer's pattern had actually brought him to police attention before that final arrest. In May 1991, officers responded to a call about a bleeding, disoriented young man wandering a Milwaukee street, only to be persuaded by Dahmer, who arrived and calmly explained the man was his adult boyfriend who had simply had too much to drink during a domestic dispute, to release the victim back into his custody. That victim, 14-year-old Connor accent to some phone, was returned to Dahmer's apartment and killed within hours, a catastrophic failure that would later become a defining example of how easily a composed, unremarkable demeanor allowed Dahmer to move through the world undetected for years. What finally ended his killing spree, 2 months later, was not forensic science, but a single man's escape. On the night of July 22, 1991, a victim named Tracy Edwards managed to flee Dahmer's apartment while still handcuffed and flagged down Milwaukee police officers on the street. When officers followed Edwards back to the apartment to investigate, they discovered photographs of dismembered victims and, in short order, human remains stored throughout the residence, including body parts kept in a refrigerator and a barrel of acid used to dissolve remains. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. He confessed extensively during questioning, cooperating with investigators in a way that many later found as unsettling as the crimes themselves, calmly walking detectives through years of killings in methodical detail, including how he selected victims he believed had few connections who would report them missing quickly, a calculation that allowed his crimes to continue undetected for far longer than they otherwise might have. In February 1992, after a trial in which his defense argued he was legally insane, a jury rejected that argument and found him sane and guilty of 15 of the 17 murders, resulting in 15 consecutive life sentences, a term of more than 900 years that made the question of parole entirely academic. He did not serve them for long. On November 28, 1994, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution named Christopher Scarver beat Dahmer to death during a work assignment, ending the case not with an appeal or a parole hearing, but with violence inside the very institution meant to hold him accountable. Milwaukee's black and gay communities, from which many of Dahmer's victims had come, spent years afterward pressing the city to reckon publicly with how thoroughly the earliest warning signs, including the 1991 incident involving Conorac Synthesumphone, had been dismissed, a reckoning that led to significant, lasting changes in how the Milwaukee Police Department trained officers to respond to reports involving vulnerable victims. 2. Aileen Wuornos, Central Florida. Roughly 2 years into Dahmer's killing spree, a very different kind of case was unfolding along the highways of Central Florida. Between 1989 and 1990, a woman named Aileen Wuornos, who worked as a sex worker along Florida's interstate corridors, shot and killed at least 6 men who had picked her up, later claiming each killing was committed in self-defense against clients who had attacked her. Wuornos had lived an exceptionally difficult life before the killings began, raised largely by her grandparents after her mother abandoned her as an infant, reportedly subjected to abuse throughout her childhood, and living on the streets or in survival relationships from her early teenage years onward, a background her defense would later argue shaped the violence that followed, without excusing it. Investigators, working a string of bodies found dumped near highways in Central Florida throughout late 1989 and 1990, struggled initially to connect the killings to a single suspect, since the victims appeared to have little in common beyond the manner and location of their deaths. The break came through old-fashioned detective work rather than any forensic breakthrough. Investigators traced pawned items belonging to several of the victims, cameras, tools, and identification cards sold at pawn shops across the region, back to paperwork bearing identifiable fingerprints belonging to Wuornos and her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. That evidence led police to Wuornos in January 1991. She confessed to police during lengthy interrogations, though she would later argue in court that the killings were acts of self-defense rather than premeditated murder, a claim complicated by the sheer number of victims and the consistency of the pattern across each killing. Each man shot multiple times, robbed, and left near a roadway across a span of Central Florida counties. Prosecutors disagreed, and in January 1992, she was convicted of the first of the murders and sentenced to death, a trial that drew national media attention in part because women were, and remain, an extreme rarity among convicted serial killers in the United States. She was ultimately convicted in 6 of the killings and received 6 death sentences. Wuornos spent a decade on Florida's death row, offering shifting and often contradictory accounts of her own guilt and motivations, at times recanting her claims of self-defense entirely and demanding that her own appeals be dropped so that her execution could proceed. She was put to death by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, becoming one of the few women executed in the United States in the modern era, and her case remains one of the most extensively examined in American criminology, not because the facts of who committed the killings were ever seriously in doubt, but because of the ongoing debate over what drove her to commit them, a debate that has produced documentaries, films, and academic studies examining how a lifetime of documented abuse and exploitation intersected with, without excusing, 6 deliberate acts of homicide. 3. Danny Rolling, Gainesville, Florida. That same year, in August 1990, the small college town of Gainesville, Florida, home to the University of Florida, was shattered by a killing spree that unfolded over just a few days as students returned to campus for the start of the fall semester, a period when apartment complexes near the university were filled almost entirely with young people living away from home for the first time, many of them with lax security and doors that did not lock as securely as they should have conditions. Rolling exploited methodically as he moved from one victim to the next over a span of roughly 72 hours. A man named Danny Rolling broke into the apartments of 5 college students: Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Poles, and Manuel Tabawada, killing each of them with a hunting knife in attacks so brutal and so deliberately staged, with bodies posed, mutilated, and in one case decapitated, that the crimes brought the start of the semester to a terrified standstill. Thousands of students withdrew from the university or fled the city entirely in the days that followed, unable to sleep in a town where a killer was still at large and where campus police could offer no clear description of a suspect. Rolling was not identified through the Gainesville murders themselves. He was arrested weeks later, in September 1990, on unrelated armed robbery charges in Ocala, Florida, and for years afterward he denied any connection to the Gainesville killings, even as investigators built a circumstantial case against him using fiber evidence, semen samples, and a distinctive knife believed to match the murder weapon, evidence that was strong but not, on its own, considered conclusive enough to guarantee a conviction at trial. It was ultimately DNA evidence, combined with his own decision, years later and just before his trial was set to begin, to plead guilty and confess in graphic detail, that connected him conclusively to the killings. A confession that came only after years of legal maneuvering and repeated delays that left the victims' families waiting for a resolution that seemed, for a long stretch of the early 1990s, as though it might never arrive through the courts at all. Rolling also confessed at that time to killing 3 members of his own family, his father, mother, and nephew, in Shreveport, Louisiana, in 1989, an earlier act of violence that had gone completely unconnected to him until his own admission, bringing his total confirmed victim count to 8. He was sentenced to death in 1994 for the 5 Gainesville murders, and spent 12 years on Florida's death row before he was executed by lethal injection on October 25, 2006. His crimes, and the panic they caused on a college campus at the start of a school year, would later serve as inspiration for a well-known slasher film franchise, a strange cultural afterlife for a case that had genuinely terrorized an entire community and left scars on Gainesville that residents describe as still present decades later. 4. Pamela Smart, Derry, New Hampshire. In Derry, New Hampshire, the same period produced a very different kind of solved case, one built not around a serial killer, but around a single calculated murder and the teacher who orchestrated it. In May 1990, a 22-year-old high school media coordinator named Pamela Smart began a sexual relationship with the 15-year-old student, William Flynn, and prosecutors would later argue that she manipulated Flynn and several of his friends into murdering her husband, Gregory Smart, so that she could collect on his life insurance and be free of the marriage. Gregory Smart was shot to death in the couple's dairy condominium on May 1st, 1990, while Pamela Smart was reportedly out at a school event that evening, an alibi that initially placed her outside any obvious suspicion. Investigators initially treated it as a possible burglary gone wrong, staged to look like a break-in, but the involvement of a group of teenagers who could not keep the secret to themselves quickly unraveled the plan, as rumors spread through Winnicott High School and eventually reached investigators through students who came forward, unable to live with what they knew. By the time the case reached trial, several of the teenagers involved, including the young man who fired the fatal shot, had testified against Smart in exchange for reduced sentences of their own, describing in court how Smart had allegedly told them killing her husband was the only way she could be free. Pamela Smart was convicted in March 1991 of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering, and she received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. A sentence her co-conspirators, who actually carried out the killing, did not receive due to their plea agreements, a disparity that has fueled decades of debate and appeals about the fairness of her sentence relative to theirs. She remains incarcerated today, held at a facility in New York under an interstate agreement, since New Hampshire has no long-term women's prison of its own. Her case became one of the most heavily televised trials of its era, broadcast gavel to gavel on court TV, and it is often cited as a forerunner to the modern era of televised true crime coverage that would come to dominate cable news only a few years later. The sentencing disparity at the heart of her case has never fully faded from public conversation. William Flynn, the teenager who fired the fatal shots, served just over 20 years before being paroled, while Pamela Smart, convicted as the person who orchestrated the killing but who did not pull the trigger herself, remains behind bars decades later with no realistic prospect of release, a contrast her supporters have pointed to for years in arguing that her sentence was disproportionate, while prosecutors and Gregory Smart's family have maintained that a woman in a position of trust who manipulated a child into committing murder bears a different, and arguably greater, moral responsibility than the teenager she manipulated. If a case like this one grips you the way it gripped the country when these stories first broke, take a moment now to subscribe, because we bring you real, carefully researched true crime cases like these twice a week, cases built entirely on documented fact rather than speculation. 5. Keith Hunter Jesperson, Pacific Northwest and multiple states. Out on the highways of the Pacific Northwest, a long-haul truck driver named Keith Hunter Jesperson was living a double life that would not fully come to light until 1995. Beginning in January 1990 with the murder of a Portland, Oregon woman named Tonja Bennett, Jesperson strangled at least 8 women in California, Florida, Nebraska, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming. Most of them women he encountered along his trucking routes, hitchhikers or sex workers he judged unlikely to be missed quickly or connected back to him across so many different states. He became known as the Happy Face Killer after sending taunting and signed letters to newspapers and investigators, each one marked with a small hand-drawn smiley face, boasting about killings that police had not yet solved, providing details about the crimes that only the actual killer could have known, details he used specifically to prove authorship of the letters once law enforcement began to doubt whether they were genuine, and, in one bizarre and tragic twist, allowing 2 entirely innocent people, Laverne Pavlinac and her boyfriend John Sosnovsk, to be wrongly convicted after Pavlinac falsely confessed to the Bennett murder in an attempt to escape an abusive relationship, providing details she had gathered from news coverage to make the false confession convincing. Jesperson, furious that 2 other people were receiving credit, in a sense, for his crime, only escalated his killing afterward, later telling investigators the wrongful arrests had emboldened rather than deterred him, since it appeared to prove that he could commit murder without ever becoming a serious suspect himself. He was finally arrested in March 1995 after the murder of his own girlfriend, Julie Ann Winningham, and Washington State led investigators directly to him, since as someone who had known the victim personally and had a documented history with her, he became an obvious early person of interest in a way his more anonymous, transient victims had never allowed him to become before. Once in custody, he initially denied any involvement, but within days he wrote a lengthy confession letter to his own brother, laying out the killings in detail, a letter his brother ultimately turned over to authorities rather than protect him. Once in custody, he began confessing more broadly and in graphic detail, eventually providing information that led to the exoneration and release of Pavlinac and Sosnovsk later that same year, nearly 6 years after they had been wrongly imprisoned. Jesperson was convicted and sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms in Oregon in 1995 and additional convictions in California in 2010 and in Florida as recently as 2024, tied to victims identified decades after their deaths through advances in DNA testing and genetic genealogy, have continued to add to his sentence even in recent years. He remains incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he has spent much of his time producing artwork that has occasionally surfaced for sale on so-called murderabilia websites, a detail that continues to disturb the families of his victims. 6. Chester Turner, Los Angeles, California. In Los Angeles, California, a different kind of predator operated for over a decade along a several-mile stretch of Figueroa Street south of the 10 freeway. Between 1987 and 1998, a man named Chester Turner, a former pizza delivery driver who at times lived in a mission in the area where he later killed, raped and strangled at least 14 women, most of them vulnerable women involved in sex work or struggling with homelessness and addiction during the height of a crack cocaine epidemic that had devastated parts of South Los Angeles. One of his victims was pregnant at the time of her death, resulting in a separate charge for the death of her unborn child, and his victims ranged in age from their early 20s to their mid-40s, women whose deaths, because of who they were and the circumstances of their lives, drew comparatively little sustained media attention or investigative urgency at the time, a pattern that has since been the subject of considerable criticism of how the case was handled in its earliest years. For years, the killings went unsolved, and in a devastating failure of the justice system, an innocent man named Louis Jones was wrongly convicted and spent 14 years in prison for one of Turner's murders before DNA evidence eventually cleared him, a wrongful conviction that stood for over a decade while the actual killer remained free and continued killing in the same neighborhood. Turner himself was not identified as a suspect until 2002, when he was arrested for the rape of a woman who survived the attack, and his DNA, entered into a state database following that arrest, matched evidence for more than a dozen unsolved South Los Angeles homicides stretching back 15 years. He was convicted in April 2007 of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder for the death of the unborn child, and sentenced to death. And in 2014, he was convicted of 4 additional murders and sentenced to death a second time. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California, and in recent years has also been charged in connection with an additional 1998 murder in Utah, a case that remains pending even as he continues serving his California sentence. Investigators later determined that Turner was not the only predator operating in South Los Angeles during those years. At least 2 other serial killers, one of them responsible for the so-called grim sleeper killings that spanned more than 2 decades, were active in overlapping neighborhoods during roughly the same period, a convergence that for years made it extraordinarily difficult for detectives to determine which killings belonged to which perpetrator, and that likely allowed each of them to continue operating longer than they otherwise might have, since patterns that might have stood out clearly against a single killer's signature were instead blurred across multiple, simultaneous investigations. 7. Robert Lee Yates, Jr., Spokane, Washington. 400 miles to the north, in Spokane, Washington, a former Army helicopter pilot named Robert Lee Yates, Jr. was living what appeared to be an entirely respectable life as a husband and father of 5 children, while murdering women, most of them sex workers, across the Spokane area between the mid-1970s and 1998. Yates solicited his victims for sex, shot them, and buried several of them in the yard of his own family home on Spokane South Hill, a detail that stunned investigators and neighbors once it came to light, since Yates had spent years living an outwardly ordinary suburban life directly on top of evidence of his crimes, mowing the same lawn and hosting the same family gatherings within feet of buried remains. He was finally identified in 2000 after DNA evidence recovered from his vehicle, a white Corvette he had once owned and that had, ironically, already been pulled over once by the very task force searching for it, only for the report to misidentify the car's model and let the connection slip past investigators for a critical stretch of time during which he continued killing. Once the DNA match was confirmed, facing overwhelming evidence, Yates pleaded guilty in 2000 to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder in Spokane County in exchange for a sentence of 408 years rather than the death penalty, a deal that spared his life for those particular killings. One prosecutors accepted in part because Yates agreed to provide detailed information about where several victims' remains could still be found, information that allowed grieving families to finally bury their daughters, sisters, and mothers after years of not knowing what had become of them. Prosecutors in neighboring Pierce County, however, pursued 2 additional murder charges separately, arguing those killings were connected to the same pattern, and in October 2002 a jury convicted him and sentenced him to death for those 2 killings. That death sentence was later commuted to life in prison without parole after Washington state abolished capital punishment entirely in 2018, converting every death sentence in the state to life imprisonment, a legal change Yates himself had no part in seeking, and one that arrived only because of a broader statewide policy shift unrelated to his individual case. At his 2000 sentencing hearing, relatives of his victims addressed him directly in the courtroom, several of them describing decades of unresolved grief, with one man asking Yates outright whether he understood what it was like to attend a family reunion at a cemetery for 25 years running, a question Yates did not answer. Yates remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. 8. Angel Maturino Reséndiz, Texas and multiple states. Farther south, along railroad lines that stretched across multiple states, a Mexican national named Angel Maturino Reséndiz carried out a string of murders between the mid-1980s and 1999, killing at least 8 people confirmed through DNA, and investigators believe as many as 15, targeting homes located near railroad tracks in Texas, Illinois, Florida, Kentucky, California, and Georgia. Reséndiz would hop freight trains between crime scenes, a method that made his movements almost impossible for investigators in different jurisdictions to connect, since a murder near a rail line in Texas and another near a rail line in Georgia weeks later appeared, on paper, to be entirely unrelated crimes handled by entirely separate police departments, with no reason to compare notes. That changed only when DNA evidence tied him conclusively to the 1998 murder of Houston physician Claudia Benton, who was stabbed and bludgeoned with a 2-foot bronze statue in her own home just steps from a rail line, and to the killings of a church pastor and his wife near Houston, who had been beaten to death with a sledgehammer in their sleep, killings that at first appeared entirely unconnected to authorities, working each case independently. The FBI placed Reséndiz on its 10 most wanted list in 1999, and the case finally drew coordinated national attention, complicated further by the fact that Reséndiz had already been detained and deported to Mexico as an illegal immigrant on at least one occasion during his killing spree. With border agents unaware, they were releasing a man wanted for multiple homicides, a jurisdictional gap between immigration enforcement and criminal investigation that allowed him to continue killing even after law enforcement had briefly held him in custody. Facing intense pressure and a nationwide manhunt, Reséndiz surrendered voluntarily in June 1999, crossing a border bridge into El Paso, Texas, in a surrender arranged through negotiations involving his own family and a Texas Ranger who had built a relationship of trust with them over the preceding weeks. He was convicted of capital murder in the killing of Claudia Benton and sentenced to death. Reséndiz's trial drew particular attention because his defense argued he suffered from severe mental illness and genuinely believed, at times, that he was an angel carrying out a divine mission, a claim psychiatrists for the defense supported, but that a judge ultimately ruled did not meet the legal standard for incompetency, allowing the execution to proceed as scheduled. Reséndiz was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas, on June 27, 2006, offering an apology to his victims' families in his final statement before he died, telling them plainly that he knew he deserved what was coming. 9. Gary Ridgway, King County, Washington. That brings the story back to Gary Ridgway, the case that opened this account. Beginning in 1982, bodies of young women, many of them runaways or sex workers who frequented the Pacific Highway South Corridor in unincorporated King County, began turning up along the Green River in King County, Washington. The first 5 discovered within a single month that summer when 2 teenage boys found the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield floating in the river, and over the following 2 decades the death toll climbed so high and remained so persistently unsolved that the Green River Killer became one of the most notorious unidentified predators in American history, the subject of a task force that at its peak involved dozens of detectives working the case full-time, at enormous public expense, with no resolution in sight for year after year. Ridgway had actually been questioned by investigators as early as 1984, after one witness reported seeing a victim get into his vehicle, and he had submitted a DNA sample voluntarily in 1987 during a search of his home, but the forensic technology of the time was not sensitive enough to conclusively match that sample to crime scene evidence, and Ridgway was released to continue his ordinary life as a truck painter for another 14 years. It was not until 2001, when advances in DNA testing allowed investigators to re-examine that decades-old sample, that Ridgway was finally arrested, initially on 4 counts of murder. Facing the possibility of a death sentence, Ridgway agreed to a plea deal, negotiated by King County Prosecutor Norm Malum, in which he provided exhaustive, detailed confessions and helped investigators locate the remains of victims still missing, in exchange for prosecutors taking the death penalty off the table entirely. In November 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder, at the time the largest number of murders any person had ever admitted to in United States history, and he was sentenced that December to 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. In 2011, after the remains of a 49th victim, 20-year-old Rebecca Marrero, were discovered in a ravine near Auburn, Washington, just 100 feet from where another of his victims had previously been found, Ridgway pleaded guilty to that killing as well, bringing his confirmed total to 49 murders, though he himself has claimed at various points that the true number may be considerably higher, and investigators to this day believe several additional missing women from the same era may also have been his victims. He remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. It is also worth noting how many of these 9 cases ended, ultimately, with a death sentence rather than a term of life imprisonment, and how differently those sentences played out in practice. Wuornos, Rolling, and Reséndiz were all executed, their sentences carried out within roughly a decade to 16 years of conviction. Turner remains on death row in California, a state that has not carried out an execution in years, and where his sentence, for now, functions in practice much like a life term. Yates's death sentence was converted to life imprisonment entirely outside his control once Washington abolished the practice altogether. Ridgway, despite confessing to more murders than any of the others, was spared the death penalty from the outset, a decision prosecutors made deliberately, trading his life for his cooperation in locating victims whose families might otherwise never have learned what became of them. That range of outcomes, from execution to a negotiated life sentence in exchange for confession, says as much about the priorities and legal frameworks of the states where these men were tried as it does about the relative severity of what each of them did. Taken together, these 9 cases span more than a decade of American crime and cover territory from the Pacific Northwest to the Gulf Coast, from college dormitories to interstate highways to a family ranch house with bodies buried in the yard. What connects them is not geography or method, but timing. Every one of these men committed his crimes during a specific window in American law enforcement history, an era after violent crime had become a matter of intense public concern, but before DNA testing, expanded databases, and coordinated multi-jurisdictional task forces existed in the form we take for granted today. Several of these cases, Yates, Turner, Ridgway, Reséndiz, and later charges against Jesperson, were only closed because evidence collected years or even decades earlier was finally run against genetic profiles that did not exist as searchable tools at the time of the original crimes. Technology that in some instances sat waiting in an evidence locker for 15 or 20 years before it was capable of delivering an answer. Others, like Dahmer's, Rolling's, and Smart's, were closed the old-fashioned way, through the courage of a single escaped victim, a lucky arrest on unrelated charges, or teenagers who could not keep a secret. Wuornos' case closed through old-fashioned detective work, tracing pawned property back to a name at a counter in a pawn shop, the kind of unglamorous legwork that rarely makes for dramatic television, but that has closed more cases across American history than any single piece of forensic technology. None of these resolutions came quickly, and none of them undid the harm already done. The families of Dahmer's 17 victims waited years, sometimes without even knowing their loved one was among the dead, until his own confession named them. The Green River Task Force spent nearly 2 decades and untold millions of dollars before a single DNA match finally closed a case that had, for years, seemed destined to remain permanently unsolved. What these 9 cases represent collectively is a record of what patience, forensic advancement, and sometimes sheer chance can eventually accomplish, even against men who spent years, in some cases decades, believing they had gotten away with it entirely, hiding in plain sight as truck drivers, factory workers, helicopter pilots, and family men. For the families who waited through those years, closure arrived far too late to undo the loss, and in several of these cases arrived only after other people had already suffered the additional injustice of wrongful arrest or wrongful conviction along the way. But it arrived, and in an era where so many cold cases never see resolution at all, where families wait decades for a phone call that never comes, that alone sets these 9 apart, and offers a measure of evidence, however imperfect, that the passage of time does not always favor the guilty. Look back across these 9 names: Jeffrey Dahmer, Aileen Wuornos, Danny Rolling, Pamela Smart, Hunter Jesperson, Chester Turner, Robert Lee Yates Jr., Angel Maturino Reséndiz, and Gary Ridgway, and a few hard truths sit underneath all of them. Every one of these men lived an ordinary life alongside his crimes. Dahmer clocked in at a chocolate factory. Yates flew helicopters for the United States Army and later coached his children's sports teams. Turner delivered pizzas. Reséndiz rode freight trains like an anonymous drifter, invisible to any single police department because his crimes crossed so many jurisdictions that no one agency ever held the full picture at once. That ordinariness was not incidental to how long they evaded capture. It was, in nearly every case, the very thing that protected them, because neighbors, co-workers, and even family members simply could not reconcile the person they knew with the crimes investigators would eventually prove beyond doubt. It is also worth sitting with how many of these cases depended on victims and survivors whose courage or whose simple refusal to stay silent changed the entire outcome. Tracy Edwards ran from Dahmer's apartment still in handcuffs and flagged down a squad car rather than trying to quietly slip away unnoticed. A group of New Hampshire teenagers, already implicated in a murder, eventually could not live with the weight of what they had done and told the truth. A church-going community in Gainesville, Florida, buried 5 young people and kept pressing for answers for years after the story left the national headlines. And in case after case here, ordinary detective work, a pawn shop receipt, a misfiled license plate report, a DNA sample sitting patiently in cold storage, eventually did what it was always capable of doing, given enough time. None of these 9 cases were solved quickly. Most took years. 2 of them, Yates and Ridgway, took the better part of 2 decades. What connects all 9 in the end is not just the crimes themselves, but the fact that in every single instance, patience, persistence, and eventually science caught up with a man who believed, often for years at a time, that he never would be caught at all. These cases are difficult to sit with, and they should be. They involve real people, real families, and real communities who lived through losses that no arrest, no trial, and no execution could ever fully repair. But they also stand collectively as a documented record of something worth remembering. That even when the odds favor the guilty for a very long time, they do not always favor them forever. What's your take on this case? Let us know in the comments. If you found value in this story, please consider hitting subscribe and leaving a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real cold case investigation. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.